So light brown apple moth. What I'm going to ask is actually that you ask questions as I am progressing through here so that we can start a conversation, and that I'll be giving some introductory slides, kind of like what's going on with LBAM in general, specifically what's happening in the Monterey Bay region where I'm a farm advisor and some of the things that we've been seeing up there, and then I'll get into kind of more of the management aspects of light brown apple moth and some of the research that I've done over the past several years. So a little bit of about the light brown apple moth. This is an invasive pest from Australia. It's found also besides California, it's found in Hawaii, it's found in England, it's found in New Zealand and other parts of the world. It was officially detected in Alameda County, that's near San Francisco, in March 2007. But it's interesting, it was actually, before it was officially detected, it was detected by a retired professor, entomology professor from UC Berkeley, who apparently in his backyard he'd been blacklight trapping for practically his whole career in Berkeley, and he discovered this unusual specimen in his blacklight traps. He happened to be a Microlepidoptera specialist and knew that he was onto something big right away. So after that, then CDFA, USDA were involved with the final detection of light brown apple moth. So since then, in 2007, the last time I counted, there's 21 California counties now considered infested, and you see the map here of California. Those little squares are the regulated areas in California, from San Diego to the south, all the way up to the north, and I guess it was back in September, October, Mendocino County was added to the infested and regulated area. If you look at all the squares, you can see that light brown apple moth looks like it's favored by the cool coastal climates. And we'll talk a little bit about the biology in a little bit, and you'll understand that it does work better. It develops better in these cooler areas, and also higher relative humidity areas also. What's I think interesting is that you'll see that blurb, that little bulge out towards the San Joaquin Valley there, there are finds now in the Central Valley, Stockton, and considered by some as being established there now. So that's, of course, of concern. But it doesn't do really well in those hot areas. And you'll see when we talk a little bit about the biology, it sort of has a maximum threshold for development of about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's kind of putting a damper on the ability of the apple moth to develop in those hotter climates. But you can imagine here, just looking at this area now, how good it's developing in these coastal areas. It's developing well because it has a very broad host range. In fact, there is a paper that was published about 2 or 3 years ago that considered the light brown apple moth as the most prolificous insect known to man. So it has the widest host range of any type of insect that we know of. And because of that, it's well established in natural areas and landscapes in these areas, particularly because I have that experience in the Santa Cruz, Monterey area. You can see it in the landscape. It's definitely well established. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where it was first found and first discovered, it's also very well established in these natural areas and in landscapes. As far as damage, light brown apple moth is a leaf roller, okay? So typically that group is rolling leaves. It's feeding on leaves, within leaves, and just outside these leaf shelters. But also, so like you see on the right, but also it can feed on fruit. In my area, in Santa Cruz, Monterey area, we find it also on the strawberry and bush berries like blackberry and raspberries. And there, because it's a leaf roller, it kind of wants to get onto that calyx, and then it comes out and it can feed a little bit on the fruit, as we see here. I'll talk a little bit about that, more about kind of the damage and the symptoms that you would look for in just a little bit. But right now, I just wanted to get the point across that, for the most part, leaf roller, but it can have this sort of secondary damage on some fruit. It's regulated because, as Jim mentioned, the USDA considers this, and our trading partners consider this as a very important insect because of the uncertain impact on crops and natural systems. Because it has this wide host range, our trading partners, meaning other states and other countries, including Canada and Mexico, don't want it. And they can ask our APHIS, USDA APHIS, to put these restrictions on the state, and in this case, the state of California, to make sure that it's controlled so that it doesn't get into those other areas. This is a controversial insect. And for the most part, as I mentioned, it's a leaf roller. It doesn't cause extensive damage. Maybe a little bit of damage to fruit where it's not controlled, maybe in organic fruit. But for the most part, there's really a lot worse beasts out there to control. I understand there's a Polyphagus shot-hole borer meeting going on right now or whatever. That insect will kill trees. This insect will not kill plants. And there was a request going back, I think it was 2009 actually, but was more or less recently answered by USDA APHIS, a request to declassify it, meaning to deregulate it and say, well, let's let California do whatever they want with this. But their answer was that by maintaining a regulatory program for LBAM, APHIS is seeking to minimize the further spread of the moth in the United States and maintain foreign trade markets for our producers. I think if you go on and read that denial that was in the federal order, that they also talk about intra-state movement also. So in other words, Florida and Texas don't want this, and they can say, we would, if the USDA declassifies it and lets California do whatever we want, then Texas might put on a quarantine on California, Florida might put a quarantine on California, Kentucky might, and then it becomes basically a real mess to try to regulate for California producers, because you have all these different possibly conflicting or regulations coming from these different states. So that's the reasoning, and we'll let the regulators talk about that later in the presentations. That's how I understand it, and that's how I'm presenting it now. So a little bit about the impacts. I pulled this out of a recent map that was made in March 17th of the quarantine boundaries in the south area, considered the south area from San Diego, what is that, up to Los Angeles, and you see these boxes here just to illustrate what is actually quarantined right now. I can tell you that in other areas in the north, also in Santa Cruz, Monterey County, I was recently up in the Santa Rosa area, that we have growers there that are limiting their sales now to only regulated areas, because If you are having problems controlling light brown apple moth, like some of these nurseries are, they aren't allowed to ship outside their area without the inspections, these 30 days inspections. If there's a detection, then there's got to be these sprays. They didn't want, some of these smaller nurseries in particular didn't want to deal with it, so they just they eliminated certain shipments outside the quarantine area. So now they're just shipping within the quarantine areas and getting away from the regulations. So some can do that. And when I was up in Santa Rosa, they were definitely thinking about it, some of those really tiny growers. But in Santa Cruz, Monterey County, of course, we have the growers that are maybe 40% are of the product is being shipped out of the quarantine area. You can't deal with that. You have to deal with LBAM. So that's an impact. I consider it a big impact for some of the growers that have had to limit their shipments, reducing their market. Another impact, profound impact for all the growers that are dealing with LBAM is the increased use of insecticides. And I put this picture in here because I never got a picture like this until LBAM was found in some of these nurseries. It's a picture of a tractor with an air assist sprayer. And there are nurseries, particularly the large nurseries, that went from hand wand spraying, spot spraying, to entire blanket sprays of the whole nursery. They were buying air blast sprayers to cover the entire nursery with insecticide. So this is not one nursery, this is all the large nurseries are dealing with this problem in this way. Blanket applications of insecticide in many cases. So that's a huge impact. I have some anecdotal information that there's their profit margins, slim profit margins are bordering on being eliminated, no profits because of the insecticide applications that are being made. So it's very, very serious. There's also another impact is scouting costs are increased because there's no doubt that scouting needs to be intensified if you have light brown apple moth. There are numerous nurseries that are coming up with scouting teams, so they're training more of their workers to create a scouting team that goes out just before the official inspections take place. So they're getting information about when the inspection is going to come in, and they're going out with these teams that are intensely scouting those areas that are most at risk. So increased personnel costs, I consider a definite impact to the nursery industry. And then today, we're going to be talking, or later we'll be talking about the new regulations with repeat detections. And luckily I don't have to talk about that, but just to say that for those that have repeat detections, in other words, more than one detection, that the regulatory actions are going to be intensified. And I'll just leave it with that, and we'll talk about that more later this early afternoon. Okay, any questions on that so far? All that fun stuff. Everyone doesn't look happy. What's wrong? Okay. No, now we're going to talk about fun stuff for me anyway. And that's how I think because it's fun, because I think I can help you. I think I can help you with some of the information that we've produced and then can convey today. So there is a light brown apple moth best management practice manual that's available. It's on the CDFA website. Okay, you go, just Google CDFA and then light brown apple moth, and you'll get to this link that you can download the best management practice manual. And this manual was produced several years ago by some USDA, by CDFA representatives, by local ag commissioner representatives out in Watsonville, myself, some people from UC Davis, lots of nursery representation in that. So it's a really pretty good manual. I say pretty good because I was a little nervous about it at the beginning because it was still pretty general. We didn't know a whole lot about light brown apple moth, at least locally, how it worked and its, what to expect. So it had a lot of holes in it, I would say. It lacked some specificity. And so I did get a grant from the Specialty Block Grant for California. And in the past 3 or so years on that, we've worked to kind of fill some of those holes. And that's what I'm going to be presenting today, some of that research. And now to kind of summarize kind of what's to come now with the next series of slides about management that's going to complement that manual really is this list. Biology identification, the host range, the perimeter hosts, why they're really important. They might not be as important down here, I'm not sure, but I want to illustrate why they're important in the Monterey Bay region and in other areas where you might have perimeter hosts. A little bit about moth migration so you understand how far the moth can fly. A little bit about monitoring populations and scouting, how to go about that. A little bit about biological control. I worked with a CDFA biologist on augmenting biological control. We did some work on pheromone mating disruption. I can recommend it, and I'll tell you how to apply that to their nurseries. And then quite a bit of work has been done on insecticides now, so I can talk about targeting the egg stage, and I can talk about targeting the larval stages with systemic insecticides. And since I don't have a handout, right, but I have a better handout for you. If you Google UCCE Santa Cruz County, I've got my whole presentation on the website right now. So this current presentation is on there, and you can have the whole thing at your your convenience. So you don't have to write really fast. But that's the CE Santa Cruz is the website, but it comes up right at the top. If you go UCCE Santa Cruz County, it'll be right at the top of a Google search. Okay, a little bit about the life cycle. Let's start with an egg mass here. The adult will lay these egg masses. Here's one egg mass here, and here's one egg mass here that was laid earlier. When they're first laid, they're kind of a yellowish, light yellowish. There's 20 to 50 eggs that are kind of overlapping. Later, as they develop, you'll see a little black point, which is actually the embryo of the larva that's developing. So after a few days, the right developmental temperatures and that, the larva will hatch. And the little larvae are only 2 millimeters long, and they have little black heads. You normally, if you're out scouting for light brown apple moth, you normally don't see egg masses. They're really hard to see. They're often laid undersides of the leaves, but Actually, the research indicates that they're mostly laid under the leaves. But in my research on Myrica californica, it's almost like 40% of them were laid on the top of the leaves. So go figure. So I would say bottom and top of the leaves. They're hard to see though. Okay. So again, those 2 millimeter larvae emerge. They develop into larger larvae. There's 5 or 6 moltings, so each molt they get a little bit bigger. When they're full grown, they're anywhere up to 17 millimeters long or so, up to 3/4 of an inch or so. That's a really big one, well-nourished one. I'll go into a little more detail about the specific characteristics of that larva in a little bit. After the 5th or 6th instar, then it goes into this pupal stage, and this is the tank of the life stage. Is well protected against insecticides, of course. It's this quiescent stage just before the emergence of the adult. On all leaf roller larvae, you'll find two rows of spines on this particular segment. And when they're immature, they're kind of light yellow to almost translucent, and then they become more like this, where hardened and very kind of dark brown. So the next developmental stage, of course, is the adult, which emerges from the pupa. And you have, the males are about 8 millimeters long on the average. The females are about 10 millimeters long. The females, when the wings are laid back like that, you'll often see kind of a brownish area at the top, about this area. I think that's all I wanted to say on that right now. Let me go back. Forgot to talk about this. There's no diapause, meaning this process can continuously go on, can continuously develop as long as the temperatures are conducive. And the research indicates that development will continue when the temperature is between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So one life cycle can be as quick as 8 to 10 weeks. And let me show you how that could be. So degree days indicate how many heat units are accumulating for the development of insects. And in the case of light brown apple moth, one life cycle takes 1,205 degree days to complete one life cycle. And when you look at the degree days that might be accumulated in Watsonville, in Santa Barbara, and San Diego, you see over time, over the year, you'll see that obviously there's less degree days or less heat units being accumulated in the wintertime and more in the summertime. In the case of Watsonville, in the middle of summer, a life cycle of a total of 1,205 degree days can be completed in 70 days. In San Diego, in just 50 days. It illustrates, I made this slide a long time ago before San Diego was even infested, just to illustrate the example of how there are more conducive areas for light brown apple moth. And unfortunately, you guys are in the area. Any questions on that? Okay, a little bit about field identification. So, I didn't bring up my guide, but you should have a handout of my field guide. Everyone got that, the field guide. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because you've got the guide. And also I'm going to tell you about a web streaming training. It's only 13 minutes long. And if you go to, again, my website on our homepage, the UCCE Santa Cruz website, there's a link there that goes to the UC IPM website, which has got this training, this 13-minute training. I think it's better than the field guide just because we're able to put a lot more images in there and we're able to verbalize how to go about the identification of light brown apple moth. And this was considered really important to us into my program and to developing this because we thought that a lot of growers were making insecticide applications to insects that weren't light brown apple moth. So there was just a lot of insecticides being applied for no real great reason. And now it's even maybe more important that you understand what light brown apple moth larvae might look like, because that's what you're trying to control for the most part, because that's what is going to be detected by an official inspection. It's not so much the adults. The adults are fluttering around maybe at dawn or dusk, and maybe if you disturb the plants, you might see one scurry off. And that's actually, the adult is not not considered an official detection anyway. And the eggs are probably not something you're going to see, but it's the larva that you'll want to be able to identify, and that's why we emphasize that in this identification training. So I'll just say you have that guide, just to say that for the most part, these larvae, when they're 8 millimeters or larger, they'll have these pretty distinctive characteristics. The yellow to light brown head, the yellow to green prothoracic shield, the light hairs, the light legs that might be tipped with a little bit of brown, the spherical panacula, which are these little protuberances, these little dimples, or not dimples, but little spots on the body. This yellow-green to medium-green body. All of these are characteristics. There's a lot of lookalikes. There's the orange tortrix, there's the omnivorous leaf roller, there's the apple pandemus, there's the avocado leaf roller. They look somewhat like this. We try to make that distinction in our guide and in our training. But really, this guide was developed by the CDFA authority on light brown apple moth taxonomy, Mark Epstein. So we used his knowledge and his knowledge of what he's seen in California to come up with this guide. And he will tell you that we will not be able to absolutely identify it in the field, that only they can identify it up there in the lab, either through morphological features that are taxonomical features that you can see through a dissecting scope or through a microscope, hairs, how hairs are associated with the head and on the body. Certain parts of the body have certain types of hairs, or through DNA. So we know through DNA fingerprinting how to identify this. And so that's the only way And that's the way in official detections that it is identified. So you'll have an inspector go out, they'll say, this is a suspect. They're probably going to say, we're going to put this block on hold. We're going to get it identified. They send it up to CDFA, these experts. They make the positive identification. They'll get back either positive, negative, and then the various, then the regulatory agency will follow through on what has to be done. Any questions about identification? So I think you have some tools there that, okay.
How long does that identification process take?
Okay, so maybe someone from CDFA should answer that. I have an answer, but hopefully we can have someone else answer that. Does anyone have an answer for that for them? No one knows? Ali, how long does the identification process from the time that a block is put on hold, a suspect is found, goes up to CDFA? I would, 2 or 3 days. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. 2 or 3 days is probably what I've heard. It was maybe longer early on. Now they've really got it down, I think. And then one other question. Okay, all right. Anything else on that? All right, foliar symptoms. Now this, of course, is what the scout is going to be looking at. When the scout is moving through the plants, trying to find symptoms of light brown apple moth, we're looking for various distortions and leaf rolling. On the right, probably the most typical situation where the larva is pulling 2 leaves together with the webbing, seaming them together to create this shelter. Now that picture, actually, I had disturbed the larva inside to take the picture. Normally, you're not going to see the larva. You'll just see the actual leaf roll. But, of course, if you pull it apart, you'll see the webbing and you'll see the larva inside, if it's a pretty good-sized larva. On the left, you'll see another type of symptom, which is the chewing symptom. And that can take a place where either a young or a mature larva can chew through the leaf and form a hole. In this particular case, it was leucodendron. Probably what happened there is that when the leaves were well pressed together, pressed together as a growing point, the larva chewed in, and then as it grew out, you could see the holes quite apparently. But that should be that should key you in on looking down deeper to look for that larva. The other thing that you'll see, besides the leaf rolling situation, like on this alstroemeria, you'll see distorted leaves. So in this case, the whole tip of alstroemeria, the whole growing point, was pulled over. And so when you're scouting through, it just doesn't look right. Something is wrong there, and you can see how the distortion could be the key feature that homes in that scout to looking a little bit closer, to seeing if the apple moth larva is hiding in that shelter. And then, and finally on fruit, I had mentioned about this insect larva inherently wants to roll leaves and pull leaves together. In the case of fruit, the calyx, which is that leafy structure on top of the fruit, is sort of the leaf structure. And it uses that as its hiding place and its shelter, produces its shelter, but it will come out on the fruit and feed on the fruit. In what I've heard from strawberry and berry growers, and in the cases of the most serious detections, official detections in berries, is that oftentimes where it is detected in the berries is when either a grower is kind of lost, has not done well in scouting, kind of obviously failing in finding LBAM, but not doing the job that he or she should do for in pest management in general. And the other part of this is they're often organic growers too. So the organic growers only have a few tools, and the traditional or conventional growers have a lot more tools, are probably spraying a lot more conventional insecticides for other things that also control light brown apple moth. So that's what we're seeing up in the Watsonville area. Anything on that?